Let's take a deeper dive into that second detail that Dr. Pankey talked about, which is know your patient. Know your patient. And the way I'd like to do this is I'd like to share a story with you. And the story, it's a true story. The story is about an elementary school teacher whose name was Mrs. Thompson. And her student was a boy by the name of Teddy Stoddard. So this is the story of Teddy Stoddard and his teacher, Mrs. Jean Thompson. Here's the story. As she stood in front of her fifth grade class on the first day of school, Mrs. Thompson told her children a lie. Like most teachers, she looked at her students and told them that she loved them all the same. But that simply was not true, because there in the front row, slumped in his seat, was a little boy named Teddy Stoddard. Mrs. Thompson had watched Teddy the year before and noticed that he didn't play well with other children. His clothes were messy, and he constantly needed a bath. Teddy could be unpleasant at times. It got to the point where Mrs. Thompson would take delight in marking his papers with a broad red pen and making bold X's, and finally putting a big F on the top of his papers. At the school where Mrs. Thompson taught, she was required to review each child's past records. She put Teddy's off till last. When she finally reviewed his file, she was in for a big surprise. Teddy's first grade teacher wrote, "Teddy is a bright child with a ready laugh. He does his work neatly and has good manners. He's a joy to be around." His second grade teacher wrote, "Teddy is an excellent student and well liked by his classmates. But he's troubled because his mother has a terminal illness and life at home must be a struggle." His third grade teacher wrote, "His mother's death has been hard on him. He tries to do his best, but his father doesn't show much interest. His home life will soon affect him if steps aren't taken." Teddy's fourth grade teacher wrote, "Teddy is withdrawn and doesn't show much interest in school. He doesn't have many friends, and sometimes he even sleeps in class." By now, Mrs. Thompson realized the problem, and she was ashamed of herself. She felt even worse when her students brought her Christmas presents wrapped in beautiful ribbons and bright paper, except for Teddy's. His present was clumsily wrapped in heavy brown paper that he got from a grocery bag. Mrs. Thompson took pains to open it in the middle of the other presents. Some of the children started to laugh when she found a rhinestone bracelet with some of the stones missing and a bottle that was 1/4 full of perfume. But she stifled the children's laughter when she explained how pretty the bracelet was while putting it on and then dabbing some of the perfume on her wrist. Teddy stayed after school that day just long enough to say, "Mrs. Thompson, today you smelled just like my mom used to." After the children left, she cried for at least an hour. On this very day, Mrs. Thompson quit teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic, and instead, she began to teach children. Mrs. Thompson began to pay close attention to Teddy as she worked with him. As time went on, his mind seemed to come alive. The more she encouraged him, the faster he responded. By the end of the year, Teddy had become one of the smartest children in the class. Despite her lie, he had become one of her teacher's pets. A year later, she found a note under the door from Teddy telling her that she was the best teacher he had ever had in his life. 6 years passed by, and to her surprise, another note came from Teddy. He wrote that he had finished high school third in his class and that she still was the best teacher he ever had in his whole life. 4 years later, another letter came saying that while things had been tough at times, he stayed in school and stuck with it, and he graduated from college with the highest of honors. He assured Mrs. Thompson that she was still the very best and favorite teacher he had ever had in his whole life. 4 more years passed, and yet another letter came. This time, he explained that after he got his bachelor's degree, he had decided to go a little further. Again, assuring her that she was still the best and favorite teacher he ever had. The letter was signed Theodore F. Stoddard, MD. The story doesn't end there. There was a final letter that spring. Teddy said that he had met this girl and that he was going to be married. He explained that his father had died a couple of years ago, and he was wondering if Mrs. Thompson might agree to sit in the place at his wedding that was usually reserved for the mother of the groom. Of course, Mrs. Thompson did. And guess what? She wore that bracelet, the one with the missing rhinestones. She also made sure she was wearing the perfume that Teddy remembered her mother wearing on their last Christmas together. After the wedding, they hugged each other as Dr. Stoddard whispered in Mrs. Thompson's ear, "Thank you so much for making me feel important and showing me that I could make a difference." Mrs. Thompson, with tears in her eyes, whispered back, "Teddy, you have it all wrong. You were the one who taught me that I could make a difference. I didn't know how to teach until I met you." Well, that is the story of Teddy Stoddard and his teacher, Mrs. Jean Thompson. Now, the question is, how does this apply to dentistry? Well, I think it applies in many, many, many ways. Some of the takeaways that I have from that story is, number one, often we don't know our patient's backstory. We don't know everything about our patient. The patient may present themselves as being very difficult and very challenging. And as a result of that, our behaviors may change towards that patient. We may not know the backstory. We may not know. And another point that I take away from that is we need to slow down to truly get to know our patients. It was only through Mrs. Thompson's review of his records that she really understood the backstory. Remember that at the beginning of the story. It was only through the review of the records that she truly began to know who this person was in front of them. One of the joys, I've always said that dentistry rocks. And I say dentistry rocks because we have the ability to change people's lives. And that could be something clinical, or it could be something behavioral. Clinically, we may take a patient that has some very compromised dentition, and through your wonderful care, skill, and judgment, we're able to provide that patient the smile of their dreams. It can also be behavioral. Maybe a patient just needs to be listened to. Maybe a patient just needs to be heard. Maybe a patient just needs to be encouraged. And the more our profession changes and the pace of which life moves, and let's face it, life moves pretty fast sometimes, the harder it is to actually slow down and spend time with our patients. It becomes harder and harder, especially in some practice models. If you're a PPO infected practice, it's hard to spend the time that we would like to spend on our patients because we've got to put roller skates on and shoot off to the next hallway to treat the next patient, because you have to produce about 50% more than you would have to produce if you weren't a PPO provider. So it's harder and harder to do in some practice models. But I would suggest that one of the ways that you can actually enhance your practice is to slow down. And that sounds kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it, Naren?
Absolutely, Gary. And I was just reminded of a recent episode we just recorded about Cigna cutting fees 20%. I mean, already it was very low. Now, when the fees are down 20%, you have to spend even less time to just be able to barely make what you made, last year. So doctors are put in a really tough situation where doctors go to, into health because they want to help people. They want to make a difference. But the model is such that they cannot. And
well, I also, you're right. You're spot on. I'd like to think that many dentists out there would like to kind of switch from being, just fixing problems to truly helping their patients enjoy optimal oral health.
Right. Almost like that teacher, right? I mean, she transformed him and he transformed her.
Absolutely. That's why I love that story. That story applies so much in dentistry, right. That if we can just slow down long enough to understand our patient, what a difference that could make in every way we interact with that patient. And imagine, through that process, changing your relationship with the patient from, you have this problem, I'll fix it, to truly becoming an advisor to the patient, becoming a guide, becoming an inspiration, becoming a resource for them, and helping them enjoy optimal oral health, which will then allow them to have better overall health because of what we know about the oral systemic connection. Well, one of the things I'd encourage you to do as you listen to this podcast, this would be a good episode to play, doctors, at a team meeting and play with your team members.